Welcome to the Table Podcast, where we discuss issues of God and culture. Brought to you by Dallas Theological Seminary.
Welcome to the table. We discuss issues of God and culture, and my guest today is Mary Jo Sharp, who teaches at Houston Baptist University in my hometown, Houston, Texas. I am a Houstonian in exile in Dallas, and she's here to talk about what she does, and I guarantee it's a surprise. So, Mary Jo, tell them what you do at Houston Baptist and why you're visiting Dallas and why you've got on the why we have you on the Table podcast. Your professional role is you are an
apologist.
Now that doesn't mean you're sorry, right?
Yeah, actually, when I went to study apologetics, my dad, he likes to tease, and he said, "Well, it's about time Christians start apologizing." Dad, that's not what it means.
Yeah, so many Christians know this, but some don't, and certainly other people don't. So what exactly is that rare breed of person that is an apologist?
What exactly are they?
Yeah.
That's an interesting question. Well, the word apologia comes from 1 Peter 3:15, and it's in that passage where Peter's addressing a group of persecuted Christians, and he's reminding them not to fear man, but to set in their hearts set apart Christ as Lord. And he says, always be prepared to give a defense. And there's your word that we transliterate to apologetics.
That's right.
To make a case. What case are we making? He further says, for the reason of the hope that is in you. So our hope in Jesus Christ, resurrected from the dead, right? So apologists are making a case either defensively against objections that come at the Christian faith, or we're making a positive case for belief in the existence of God.
Yep, the term apologia, we're in my world, the Greco-Roman world.
That's right.
It is a technical term for, as you say, making a case, for stating a defense, for presenting evidence for what you believe, etc. So you go around talking about Christianity, but it wasn't always so, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So how does a girl like you end up in apologetics?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, it's funny because people hear my name, Mary Jo, so they typically think I'm from somewhere in the Bible Belt, and I was born and raised a Christian, right? So
you got to be from Mississippi.
Yeah, that's right. But I'm actually from the Pacific Northwest. I'm from Portland, Oregon.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I was raised outside of church. I did not have a Christian upbringing. In fact, my parents had left the church themselves when I was too young to really remember.
Oh, wow.
So, my view of Christianity growing up was what I saw on TV and in the movies. It's pretty shallow, in fact. So, and I kind of didn't know why you needed religion or why you needed God. And I had a little bit of distrust going on with what I saw because there was money involved and people giving tithes, but I didn't know what that was all about. So, anyway, as a later teenager, I had been raised on a steady diet of science shows, like In Search Of and Nova and things like that. My mom was a fan of the musical arts, and so I'd gone to many symphonies and musical theater. So I had a rich cultural background. But I came to a point in my older teenage years where I realized that I didn't really have a reason to think that I mattered. And at that time, there was a high school band director who I greatly admired, and he was a Christian. And he had never shared his faith with anyone. I was the first person that he really felt a strong burden to talk to about belief in God. So my senior year, right at the time when I'm starting to think about meaning and purpose in life, he comes along, and in my senior year, he gives me a NIV one-year Bible. And he gives me the baton that he used to win the state band contest with. It was pretty cool. If you know what a baton is, that's what your band director waves around. And anyway, he said, when you go off to college, you're going to have hard questions. And I hope you'll turn to this. And I read that Bible cover to cover. In fact, I didn't stay on the one-year plan because it really wasn't what I expected. Wasn't what I was seeing in Hollywood or on TV. And reading that Bible brought me around to belief in God. But it wasn't until I went off to college and I heard the gospel. I actually heard my position as in need of a Savior, that I understood and was willing to trust Jesus and commit to Him.
So you really were the beneficiary of what we sometimes call friendship evangelism in many ways. I mean, this person had built a relationship with you in the context of working with the band, and in the midst of the trust of that relationship, took a chance in some ways.
Yeah.
And boom, changed your life.
Yeah, and it's really neat. In talking with him now, I've kept up with him. He's a professor at a university, and he tells the same story, but from the opposite side.
Yep.
About being careful about giving your testimony to kids. And he said he actually told me that when he gave me that Bible, I didn't respond well, and he thought that I might cause him some trouble over that testimony that he gave. So I think it's interesting how we both perceived that one moment in time.
Interesting. So you went off to college and obviously found an answer in Jesus, and then in coming to faith, but that doesn't explain. I mean, a lot of people come to Jesus without ending up being apologists. So what's part two?
Oh, that's great, because after becoming a Christian, I rapidly got involved with ministry, youth ministry, helping out. Met my husband. He became involved with ministry as well. We land into a youth ministry position as a married couple. And when I start noticing in the church that what I'm reading in the Bible is not consistently displayed in the lives of the believers.
Oh, imagine that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
But being that I'm not, I'm not raised in the church and I don't have any deep understanding of sin, I begin to question, well, does anybody really believe this? Because I saw so much ugly and, not just towards us, but towards each other. And so it caused me to begin to have emotional doubt. I would say it was emotional doubt. But that led to intellectual questions such as, well, why do I believe in God? I'm not sure. I don't have a response like I believe in God because of X. Now, I do believe I had a real experience. But what I've noticed is that experiences fade over time. It's hard to remember what it was I did back then and why I did it. So that fact of not the experience fading, not having anything to really say this is why I believe in God, not having that foundational evidence, I began to say, well, I'm not sure if there is a God, and for some reason, I decided that I needed to find the answers, and I needed to look at both sides. So it wasn't just enough to go out and read all the new atheist material to see all the arguments against.
Right.
I had to hear what the rebuttals were as well. And so I started listening to debates like William Lane Craig. I read The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. And I came back around to a point where the arguments for Christianity seemed to make the best sense to me. Those arguments brought me back around to belief in God. And then I thought, oh my, if I had these questions, I'm sure a lot of other people in the church have them. They're just not talking about them because I'd never heard anybody talk about doubt before in the church.
Interesting.
So then I taught a class on it in my church. I just created a class based in a survey. I was surveying church members as they were leaving worship, what of these topics, what interests you? And so I built a class around that.
Oh, wow. And so eventually you went and I take it got training in the area. And so, and then landed at Houston Baptist.
I did.
Yeah, with a whole crew of people, by the way, who are there. I mean, there are lots of people who teach there. Who, Craig Evans for example, is a very, very good friend, and there's just, you've built a really solid faculty that covers a wide variety of areas in terms of what you do. So it's been exciting to see, particularly since it's in my hometown. So
yeah. It's a great place. So we have apologetics right there in the middle of the country as well.
Exactly. So you're here to talk to us about conversations, really, in doing apologetics in the sense of how we engage with people whose worldviews are different than ours, that kind of thing. And you're also going to help us think through how we deal with the culture that's around us that claims a certain tolerance but really doesn't reflect it. So we kind of want to work through those two parts. And your approach represents something I'm pretty familiar with because I've just come from a weekend myself of doing apologetics with Greg Kokel, who is a common friend, and the whole idea of, rather than debating as we engage in apologetics, engaging and asking questions and drawing people out. I call it getting a spiritual GPS on someone. Okay,
That's great.
I say there are two rules at the beginning. You get a spiritual GPS on someone, and you turn your truth meter down so it doesn't hit tilt.
I got you. That's a good way of saying it.
And so the point here is that I really sit to listen and figure out the way in. So let's talk a little bit about that for a minute.
Yeah.
Most people, when they get the opportunity, when the door finally opens, they have a chance to talk about Christ. They get a little excited.
Yeah.
And in the midst of getting excited, I say, all right, now I'm going to stand up for God and make the case. And they tend to almost like a bull in a china shop, just roll in and try and control the discussion, that kind of thing. And you really have a different, I'll say, strategy. Coco would call it a different tactic.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
In dealing with this, how do you advise people to walk into those conversations, and what should they be seeking to do in starting off?
Yeah, I do sound a lot like Greg Kokel, by the way, in his book Tactics.
You're right.
He asks a lot of the same questions. So I always call this like conversational apologetics.
Mm-hmm.
My goal before I roll into a conversation is to actually care about people. The first thing that I want to demonstrate to a person is that I care about them. So what we're about to discuss is all wrapped up in, do I really want to serve this person, right? I've had a few atheists tell me that they felt like Christians came in and made them a Jesus project. Like they just wanted to throw their points at them, and then if they weren't ready to accept those points, then they just walk away. And that makes them feel like a project rather than a person.
Right.
So I want to try to avoid that sort of a situation. And I break down just having an effective conversation into 4 elements. And the first one is knowing what we believe. I think people don't talk to other people about their faith because they don't know their faith. They are not trained in essential Christian doctrine. They're not comfortable in their Christian skin, right? I always tell people, if you talk to me long enough, you're getting Star Wars, the Bible, Lord of the Rings, or the Chronicles of Narnia, because that's my
Take
skin.
your pick.
Yeah. That's what's going to come out of me, because that's what I talk about and care about. So we have to become the kind of people that actually know what we believe and why we believe it. So that's one of the reasons early on in Christianity, I felt intimidated to share my faith with others, because I didn't know why I believed it. And that's just vital to having an effective conversation where you don't get defensive, is just knowing your own beliefs. So that's the first part, right?
Okay.
And then the second is to truly listen to others. And we emphasize that a lot today.
Yeah.
It was truly listening to find points of communication, because just like you're not going to talk about what you aren't comfortable talking about. The other people aren't either. If you push them into an area where they have no knowledge, they have nothing to talk about with you. So I want to find points of communication by really listening to minister to them. And not only am I going to find points of communication with them, I'm going to maybe get a chance to hear their story. So how did they get to this point of accepting these beliefs as true? Very important.
Yeah, I tell people, if someone hasn't had much exposure to the church, well, there are really 2 kinds of people: the people who haven't had much exposure to the church, and the people who have and have walked away. And so, but if a person hasn't had much exposure to the church, their perception of Christianity is going to be like what you described earlier. It's going to be what they've picked up in the culture.
Yeah.
And then I like to say to our audiences in the churches, and how would you like to be that to be the definition of the Christianity you believe?
Yeah.
There's a disconnect there. So there's a lot of static to work through in a conversation if a person is coming from that kind of a place. Whereas the person who has come out of the church because in many cases they've had some type of a bad or even traumatic experience in the church, they're coming from a completely different place with a completely different set of needs. And they also come with some elements of understanding about what you're going to be talking about. So it's a completely different conversation in many ways.
Yeah, and I like that you pointed that out, because if there's a person that's coming at you from a Christian experience, but it was a hurtful one, you can expect that person may be hostile to the Christian faith, because they had been told that this was the truth. They've been told to trust. And then a lot of times that trust was greatly broken within their church experience. And so they sometimes they feel like they were swindled or, they were bamboozled. There's a good word. And so you have some back work to do with them because they don't trust the church.
Yeah, it's interesting. Craig Evans, we talked about earlier, did a book a long time ago about historical Jesus studies. And in the first chapter, he went through the biographies of the people who tend to be writing in a hostile way about, we can't know the historical Jesus. We don't really know about him. Out of the 13 people that he profiled, 12 of them grew up in the church and had a bad experience. Wow. And so, so you sit there and you go, whoa, these are people who are going, I was hurt by something that happened, and now I'm writing so that someone doesn't have to go through what I went through. That's basically, and that's a part of what's motivating them. And you look at that and you go, man, that's amazing. Yeah. And it shows how important our communities actually are, that they be authentic, that they have integrity, that we be careful about about the potential damage that we do to people, because some of that damage can be very, very hostile. Right.
Which means that there's a truth to be told as far as like propositional truth. Right. But there's also relational excellence in how we present it.
Well, and this is what I love about what you're doing, because it is this relational element that, I think I like to summarize the evangelistic process or the mission call of the church in kind of this way. We're engaged in challenging people about where they're living. The gospel challenges people, challenges all of us. Okay, and challenge is uncomfortable for people. They don't like to be challenged. Yeah. But we also have to offer an invitation. Well, I can't have a chance of them hearing the challenge unless they know I care. And so I like to say, they won't care about your challenge unless they know you care. Yeah. And once you earn that space, then people might be willing to talk to you about anything. But without that space, you're not going there and you're not getting there. Right. So this relational element, this issue of tone that comes alongside what we believe, is extremely important, and the Scripture talks about it all the time. You're in the passage 1 Peter 3. With gentleness and respect is what that passage says. That's how we're supposed to set Christ apart in our hearts and have a defense within us. So I love the relational emphasis that you have, and I love the call to walk into a conversation. And my first assignment, should you choose to accept it, is to listen. Yeah. Is to actually get oriented to where the person is coming from. So you begin to get a sense of, all right, what is causing this person to be where they are, and how do I think about addressing that?
Exactly. And because you've done that, you've listened to them, then you find these points of communication where you can start asking questions. And that's the next element that I'll include is, and this is where, Greg Kokel and I have a lot of similar questions. Yes. In that when you hear people say things, you ask them, what do you mean by that? You don't just let it fly by and try to answer and respond right away. Well, I don't agree with that, because rather you give them a time to clarify their statement. Because what I have found is that sometimes I don't understand what they're trying to say, but sometimes they don't understand what they're trying to say. So asking, what do you mean by that? Right. That's a point of clarifying, helping them uncover, well, when I say that Christians are intolerant, what do I mean when I say that? So it helps them to uncover the truth of their own belief. Right. That helps both of us.
That's right.
That helps both of us.
And the more you're able to talk about that, the better the grounding is. I mean, I see it as a kind of way of drilling down. You're drilling down beyond the surface, because one thing that you want to know is this person just repeating this because this is the way they engage with Christianity and it's all they've heard? This is the objection. I play this card, and that usually puts people off, and I can keep them at arm's distance by saying this. That may be all that they're doing. They may not act.
Yeah.
So beyond the question of what do you mean by that, and I know another question that Greg likes to ask us, something like, and why do you believe that, or what's behind that? Those kinds of questions, where you actually are drilling down to figure out, all right, where's this person getting this from?
Right, and I sort of have a process of questions I go through before I engage answering in responding. I say, what do you mean by that? And my next one's going to be a how do you know that, which is what you were just talking about. So where are you getting that from?
Right.
Sourcing their beliefs. And that's really important, because I think that's where you're going to see a lot of people haven't sourced their belief.
That's right.
They haven't spent that time.
Again, you're going to meet kind of two kinds of people. The people who simply have absorbed like a sponge what the culture has said about Christianity, and that's what they're giving you. And then when you probe deeply, you understand that they say, well, that's just the way, or that's what I've heard, or that's what I've seen in the paper, or whatever, that's what I've seen on Google, whatever, the answer is there. But then there are other people who will answer that question, and they'll start using names and books.
Yeah.
And then different conversation.
Yeah, it's going to be different.
Yeah.
Greg Kokel says, sometimes if you encounter a person that has done more work than you let him be the expert.
That's right.
Right?
That's
so
right.
that you can learn from
Just let them draw
engage.
out and see where they're coming from, et cetera. I really do think, like I said, I call it getting a spiritual GPS. You do a lot of listening. Great. You're just getting them located on a map so that you have a sense of what motivates them, what drew them in, did they have an experience that gets in the way, all those kinds of features that frame what they're telling you, the content of what they're telling you. It's really what you're after. So, and what's the fourth area?
Well, before I move into the fourth area, I would say the last question is, why do you believe that? Which you brought up.
Okay, right.
And the reason I want to make sure we hit this one is because the why gives you their backstory.
Right, exactly.
And because we're dealing with a human being made in the image of God, their story is important.
Right.
It's important to God. It's important for us to minister to them. So I don't want to miss out on a chance to really know them and why they're at this point. So I'm going to say, not only clarify for me, what do you mean by that? Where are you getting this from? But now I want to know who you are, where you've come from, and get that backstory. And then the fourth area is respond. And I gave some ideas today about different responses that we can give, because Christians typically have this, I got to lay out my testimony, or I've got to give the gospel in this manner.
Right.
But there's a lot of things that you can discuss. You can give, you can point out a problematic statement that you've heard. So I gave an example of a guy who told me he was Buddhist, who was sitting next to me on a plane. So I said, I didn't know much about Buddhism. Why don't you tell me what Buddhists believe? So he tells me there's no right or wrong. And then later on, he gets into politics. And it's already funny.
Yeah, I know.
And he says, the war in Iraq is wrong.
Yeah.
So,
okay, all right. So we obviously turned a page.
Right. This is a problematic statement for his worldview. If he's going to claim to be Buddhist, then he can't claim something as absolutely wrong like that.
Yeah.
So I asked him that question, how does a Buddhist reconcile this? And because I pointed that out, he stopped talking and he just kind of looked at me. And he was figuring out that inconsistency, that he had an inconsistent worldview. He couldn't say this and then not adhere to it. Right. So I think that's important, because it shows people if their worldview is livable, if it makes sense in the reality of the human experience. And his did not. So that's important.
I call that giving people pause. I think Greg Kokel calls it, you want to put a stone in their shoe.
Yeah.
You just kind of, ooh, wow, what's that doing there? It kind of is and people do learn in the midst of those conversations, on both sides of the conversation sometimes. But now I want to talk about kind of what frames that conversation, and I kind of want to set it up this way. Religion, there's an old line that says there are two things you don't talk about. You don't talk about religion, and you don't talk about politics. All right? So we got them both going these days. Yeah. So, but anyway, and part of the reason for that is that religion is such a deeply personal element. And what our culture has done with religion and religious discussion is to throw up this idea of tolerance, which is a way of talking about let's not challenge each other too much in some ways. So I know you've given a lot of thought to the way tolerance does and doesn't work in our culture, in our society. So I'm just that's just a wide open question. Talk to me about tolerance so I can be tolerant or intolerant? What am I supposed to be?
Yeah, actually, there's so many ways we could go with this. Well, first of all, I want to point out, and I'll be just discussing this later today with the group that I'm speaking to at DTS, on how tolerance is actually set up by Jesus himself in the Sermon on the Mount from Luke 6, the passage on doing good to those who don't necessarily do good to you, right? This is, he gives a clarion call basically for what we view as tolerance, putting up with others. But he goes beyond that. He's not just putting up with people. He says that you have to do good to those who persecute you and do good to those who hate you. Because he says, what good is it if you only do good to those who do good to you?
That's right.
And what we're seeing in our current culture is this idea of tolerance has shifted to where we have to accept other people's views. So there's no possibility of doing good to those with whom we adamantly disagree with, because tolerance is morphing to mean I only do good to those who think like me. I only do good to those who act like me. I only do good to those who agree with me. And unfortunately, if we go to Matthew 5:43, this is the kind of attitude that Jesus was specifically teaching against. Love your neighbor and hate your enemy. He flips that, right? He says, you do good to those whom you disagree with. Love your enemy. So when I talk about tolerance, I want to root it squarely within the scripture and Jesus' teaching. In it, he presents the only sort of environment in which hatred will starve. And it's a radical, unconditional love, which is the Christian basis for tolerance. So that's where I start with Christians.
So you start with a biblical view of tolerance, and I'm sensing in the background there is a challenge to the unbiblical view of tolerance, which is so dominant around us, which tends to say, if I can, it's almost like the old flag, don't tread on me, don't go into this territory when it comes to religion, and don't mess with the way people think. And yet, again, because the gospel has challenge built into it, you can't do mission without challenge. It doesn't happen. So how do you do this? So you're really putting together two things that we constantly talk about here as well, which is this combination of what we might call compassion and conviction. You have convictions on the one hand, but you want to deliver them with a compassion, with an understanding, with a sensitivity. So you aren't just bashing people where they disagree, but you actually are communicating your care for them as you engage.
Right. And there's sort of a groundwork for why intolerance has become like a catchword, and and why it's in the area of religion. Like we don't talk about this. You just have to tolerate, and that goes back to the idea of the sacred secular split that has become so prevalent in our culture. So you have that some ideas belong in this, like what we would call the upper story. It's a fictitious story, two different realms of existence. And in one is where all values like religious morals, things like that, are relegated to what we call the sacred realm. And that is private to the individual and subjective to their view. And then you've got this other realm, which is the public realm. And that's being said as, this is the cold, hard fact realm.
Right.
So basically anything we can empirically observe without going too far into that. So that I think is at the basis of this. Like, we don't talk about this, we just sort of tolerate, right? And I think that sacred secular split has caused us to think, even Christians to think, well, I wonder if I shouldn't talk about this because it belongs in the private realm. It's the sacred.
Right.
And we're starting to see that Christians are adopting this view that some things in life are public, and religion is not one of those things. And I think that's what causes Christians to be sort of bullied by this idea of intolerance, that if you discuss your beliefs in public, you're not being tolerant of the Muslim, you're not being tolerant of the atheist. So I want to make sure that we have that understanding that that's going on in the background. We tend to split things up as a society, but what concerns me even more is that this has gotten into the church, that Christians go and serve their time, but that's their view.
Yep.
So they don't want to go push their religion on others, and that's coming out of this sacred secular split.
Yeah, there are two things that are going on here simultaneously. I'm going to see if I can remember them both. And the one is, one of the reasons why religion has tended to be a taboo subject, there actually was, in one sense, a good cause for it, and that was what helped to trigger the Enlightenment and make it work culturally was all the religious war that had preceded it. The people had fought to the death, in not little wars. One of them is called the 100 Years' War. I tell people that's a long war.
That is. That leaves a long scar.
That's right. It leaves a long scar. And so you've got so what the Enlightenment did is we're going to put a religion out of bounds so we don't end up in this such terribly hostile space that religion in our recent history has tended to produce.
Yeah.
Now I can understand a society that reacts that way when religion in the broadest sense of the term. Now, of course, what's difficult here is that you had the way the faith was handled, but you also had the nationalism and the statism that came with it that actually was probably more responsible for the violence than the religion was, although people thought they were fighting over truth. And so I understand those origins. But then the other thing that happens, and this is the sinister part of it, and I mean that word, and I'm thinking about what T.S. Eliot called chestless people, that we end up engaging the world, but we don't end up reflecting on our values. We don't, values aren't just personal, they are societal.
Yeah.
And so when you pull that out of the equation and you end up with this vacuum, this empty-chested life, no wonder you get chaos.
Yeah.
That's where we end up unless we talk about what drives us and what we can share in common and what we may differ on that will make us better neighbors. And the only way we can be better neighbors with one another is to have those serious conversations.
Yeah. And, you brought up T.S. Eliot.
Yeah.
And that's also in The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis, when the first chapter being called Men Without Chests. And what he was reacting to was he had received a grammar book to review because, of his profession. And so he's reading through it. And he's noticing that moral relativism is being taught in this grammar book for children, who are like high school age and under, without being, the students aren't being told that it's moral relativism, that all statements of value are meaningless. That's what's in there. So he's saying before the boy or the girl is old enough to understand that they have engaged in philosophy, even the potential to understand this is being cut out of their soul.
Yeah.
So you're developing, like what you said, like T.S. Eliot says, C.S. Lewis also says, men without chests. So you expect of them honor and virtue and all these things, but you're not going to get it. You kind of laugh at virtue, but then you expect it.
Now, I grew up in a high school that was very deep in the humanities. As I said, I didn't become a Christian until I was in college. So this is not a Christian school, but it was interesting. In our English class, we were reading stuff like T.S. Eliot. We were reading the poem called The Hollow Men. That's actually what the title of the piece is. And the point that was being made, this is in a secular context. The point that was being made is that we do need to think about our values and how our values impact people.
Yeah.
So at least we were being taught to think about how we're interacting with our neighbors, even in a context of a secular situation. But I went to school, I was in high school in the late 60s and early 70s. So, and I'm not sure we're doing as much of that now.
Right.
And I actually think we pay for it. We pay for it across the board in all our societal rhetoric, because we tell people these are spaces into which you may not walk, and yet they are spaces that actually are formative for how people think and act.
Yeah.
So how can you stay out of that space?
You can't. Yeah. Right. And I think this is a problem that has come from a lack of critical thinking skills. Like, we are not teaching critical thought. And I'm worried that we're teaching what to think instead of teaching critical thought. Because on the issue of tolerance, the reason I start with the scripture is you have to ground the idea of tolerance somewhere. Where are you getting the idea that you should tolerate another person? What's the basis for that? Well, Christians Christians are going to say, well, there's Jesus' teaching like we already discussed, but they're also going to say, well, look at Genesis 1, 26 through 31. Every human being is made in the image of God. And they have that image equally. They're given, so there's something about each individual that needs equal respect, that demands that respect.
There's something sacred about each person that's been created. In fact, that's what makes life sacred.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's a emphasis there. Not only is there a creation emphasis in that God made them in his image, but then when he's done, when you get to Genesis 1:31, he makes a value judgment. And he says that his creation's very good. So we see that humans have value from being made in the image of God, and also from God giving making a value statement on humanity that it's very good. So this is an impetus. This is a grounding, a foundation for why we tolerate, because people are worthy of respect. They're worthy of our tolerance towards them due to the kind of thing that they are. That's a grounding. But if you remove that sort of grounding, you say that human beings are just reducible to their material matter. They're a higher order of animal in the animal kingdom. Now what's our grounding?
Now it's survival of the fittest. I mean, you create the environment for what we're getting, which is tribalism.
Yes.
You get every group standing only for what it represents and what it believes, and anything that attacks that is an opponent to be resisted with all possible means. I mean,
right.
And we actually have that going on in our society on a regular basis now, because that's what fills the vacuum.
Yeah.
Is an intense self-interest and self-preservation,
right?
Which ultimately eats at your society.
Yeah, and that's I think that you hit it right on the head. I mean, we don't get some utopian society where everybody's viewed as equal. You get more of a survival of the fittest feel. And I think that's one of the great myths, is that when you remove a transcendent moral authority, when you remove an objective standard of goodness, that people are going to, by instinct, act right and good. And that's not the case. And so I think that that's part of what's underlying this problem with the new tolerance, because it's not really tolerance because it doesn't have its grounding anywhere. It doesn't have a basis, like we were talking about with being made in the image of God.
And then the other thing that's very much in play here that's important to say at this point is that the other thing that this vacuum doesn't recognize sufficiently is the fact that we tend to be sinful creatures, that what drives us to this selfishness is this tendency to sin, to look out for self-interest and that kind of thing. And so the society that thinks that it can be neutral and ignore the presence of sinfulness really sets itself on an unstable foundation. And the interesting thing is that the founders of at least our country were very conscious of the presence of sin and sinfulness, which is why they set up a system of checks and balances, because they didn't want too few people to have too much power.
Right.
Because they knew they'd abuse it.
Yeah.
And so what goes into this vacuum isn't a neutrality, okay, but this kind of self-focus. I actually think this isn't supposed to be a political discussion, it's a religious discussion, but but the point here is that it is the self-focus that we tend to fall into by default. If there isn't an accountability to a God who sets my values for me, that then puts me up against other people as opposed to being with them and alongside them.
Yeah, and that was the point. And if you get to the third chapter of Abolition of Man, you'd see that it's the values of some men. So the idea of we can make ourselves whatever we want, whatever we please, ends up being that some men make other men what they please. And it boils down to the man with the biggest microphone and the most influence.
Or the biggest stick.
Or the biggest stick.
Yeah. It's an interesting conversation, and I think that I do think that one of the areas where we have really missed it in terms of our public discourse is misunderstanding. I would say misunderstanding tolerance, which is kind of what you're pushing towards.
Yeah, misunderstanding it in that it's not agreeing with every view,
right,
but that it's actually putting up with something with which you disagree, right? Because on the basis of all human beings are worthy of respect and have value, but you have to ground that. You have to ground that human beings are worthy of respect and have value, and that you have a moral obligation to human beings because they have value.
So public space is going to become contested space.
Yeah.
Okay, but then the question becomes, how do you contest in the space?
Right.
And so now, putting kind of both pieces together that we've been talking about. On the one hand, there's this probing, this listening, this engagement style that has gentleness and respect tied to it on the one hand. But it isn't that it's stepping into a vacuum. There is a goal in this conversation, and that's a kind of an attempt to gain a kind of mutual understanding about what ought to be valuable to human beings, and what they ought to care about. I like to say that the church has been used to being able to say it's true because it's in the Bible. But what we now have to learn to say is it's in the Bible because it's true.
Yeah.
And we're contending for the truthfulness of why God puts it in the Bible. That's actually what we're engaged in trying to do. And if we can do that well and effectively, we actually do what we're called to do in mission.
Right.
And that's why you care about the way people think.
Yeah.
Because you care about truth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. And that's why we want to not just present propositional truth, which we can present any manner, like angry. We can look as aggressive as somebody who doesn't believe in God. A person who doesn't believe in God can come off more relationally excellent than a believer when you just focus on arguing propositional truth. But we have to couple that, like we were saying at the beginning of the show, especially in such an environment as we have now, we have to focus on that relational excellence. It has to truly be about caring about those people if we're going to be able to show them that they do have a vacuum or a void going on.
Yeah, I this is so important because I actually think the church has erred in significant ways in this area. I think we've done a relatively decent job of trying to defend what we believe, but how we have done it has actually put a lot of people off. Yeah. And in the process, distanced them from the invitation that we ultimately seek to try and deliver. I tell people, if you do such a great job in making the challenge that people are interested in the invitation, that's not a success.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
I mean, and the other half of it is that Jesus does tell us some people are not going to like your message. You're going to get pushback. Yeah. But don't complain about it. You should expect that. You don't complain about it. You should expect that. In fact, he spent the second half of his ministry telling the disciples, look, isn't this thrilling? I'm headed for a cross, and you're in the same line.
Yay! Right.
So we have to be prepared for that. But we are to do it in a way that says, God so loved the world, he gave. And so that tone is to be at the core of what we do.
Yeah, exactly. And it's tough because, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, where he's laying out the foundation there of what I would call a true tolerance, which is doing good to those who don't necessarily do good to you, doing good to those who don't do good to you. That's hard. I'm not sitting here saying, hey, we should all go out and be the best people ever. And it's so easy if we just listen to Jesus. That is a very difficult thing to do.
That's why he gives us the Spirit of God to enable us to do it, because it doesn't come to us very naturally.
Right. Yeah. And especially when you're being attacked or you're being called a bigot for your views, for traditional Christian, Orthodox views, it's getting harder and harder for people just to kind of keep their cool and not get defensive.
Okay, let's do an example. This kind of be a good way to wrap up our time.
All right.
And that is, I suspect that if a person who's a Christian goes out in the culture and speaks their mind about where they are and even does it gently, et cetera, they will still be accused of issuing a form of hate speech or something to that effect. So what kind of advice do you have for us when you're in that environment and someone plays, that card and says, you must really hate people because, and then fill in the blank, however you fill in the blank in light of, because you exclude people or whatever it is. What kind of advice do you have for people who find themselves dealing with that kind of pushback?
Yeah, I think that's a good one to focus on, because I actually think part of the problem with tolerance is a redefining of hate speech. But I would say, I'm back to the question,
Okay.
What do you mean by hate speech?
Yeah, let's apply what we've been talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
What do you mean by hate speech? And I want them to, I'm looking for their definition. Or what do you mean that I was using hate speech? So tell me how in this instance you see this as hate speech, and make the person who's accusing you of it actually bring the evidence to bear. This is why it's hate speech, and here's what hate speech is.
So you might be pushing them to think about, there's a difference between saying I disagree with you on something and attaching a motive to that represents hate.
Right.
I mean, that's one of the distinctions you want people to make.
Right.
Because some people have made the equation disagreement, at least in certain areas, equals hate.
Right.
And it may not.
Right. And hate we have to remember, hate is one of the most negatively charged words that we can use in the English language to represent an attitude. So you have to be careful just flinging it around, right? Just, we have to remember that. But yeah, I want them to be pushed back towards, where do you get an idea that hate speech exists at all? I think this is important because, for me, hate speech assumes a standard of goodness. Right? There's a standard. This is how I know what's good. And this speech over here doesn't match that standard of goodness.
Okay, now where does that come from? And we're off and running.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. So you're it's interesting because you've got a person who could well be a moral relativist playing this standards card.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. All right. That's an interesting game.
Right.
Yeah.
So where are you getting the idea that there's something, you seem to be accusing me of something like hate speech that you think has real existence, but you haven't told me on what grounding you think hate speech is a real thing at all, that it exists. You can't just say the laws of men, because those can change, right? They have changed.
Yeah.
So we need to know on what basis you think this has a real existence.
And so you're pushing for the reaction background that if you're going to say this, then you better have some basis for the standards that you set. And now the conversation can turn.
It can turn, towards that standard of goodness.
And where's that come from?
Right. And I talked to him.
Who's responsible for it?
Yeah. And I talked to him about how Christians believe it's God, and how, because he is the standard of goodness, we can say there actually is speech which does not does not match that standard of goodness. So there's actually speech that robs human beings of the goodness of speech that speech was intended for. So we can say things like this to people, but then you still need to support your view.
Well, this has been fabulous, Mary Jo. I mean, I really have enjoyed the time. It's flown by. We've talked about two very important topics: how to listen to people and how to think about tolerance and intolerance in our time. It's just a beginning conversation on what apologetics is about. I have no apology for bringing you on the air. It's been great to have you with us and to have you help us kind of negotiate this space.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it. Yeah.
And we thank you for joining us at the table. We hope you found the conversation fascinating. We hope you'll be back with us again soon.
Thanks for listening to the Table Podcast. For more podcasts like this one, visit dts.edu/the table. Dallas Theological Seminary. Teach truth, love well.